Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I have a long awaited review of a Haunting Hour episode that I really should have already reviewed by this point, but I forgot about it, so it's better late than never, I guess. This episode comes from season 1, and it was episode 5 overall. It was written by Catherine Boutry and directed by Neil Fernley, and the episode in question is Nightmare Inn. Now, Nightmare Inn is an episode that I covered back, I think, in episode 10 of the Goose Junkies podcast. And around that time, I guess I was busy and I just never got around to making a full on review for this episode, and I forgot about it. And I was reminded by one of you out there, one of you commenters, recently that I just never covered it and they wanted to see a full review of it. So here we go. We're finally going to talk about this episode. And I guess I'll provide some backstory about my love of the Haunting Hour television show. I mentioned this in the past, but I'll reiterate it again. I was in high school when this show came out, and the Hub Network was relatively new. And my brother watched a lot of Hub Network. And one day, the Haunting Hour came on, and I was blown away that there was a new kids' horror show that reminded me of Goosebumps. And I became obsessed, and I had just had to watch every single episode. And at one point, I think I had almost the entire show on my DVR. If you don't know what a DVR is, this was like before streaming and you had to still catch live TV, so you had to record it on a cable box essentially. And I basically had almost the entire show stored at one point. That and I wish I still had that DVR because I think I had the Spaceman director's cut and even the Scarecrow director's cut episode in its entirety, which was strange to think about because I have yet to find the actual recordings of those episodes. And if I ever do, I probably will archive them in some way. So, with that little tangent aside, I would watch this show a lot. I mean, a lot. I would watch a couple episodes a day at one point. And then one day I just stopped watching. I think somewhere near the end of the show in season 3, I think, or 4. I think it was 3 or 4 seasons for this show. It just kind of dropped off after, I think, the 4th season for me, and I lost interest. But Nightmare Inn, surprisingly enough, was an episode that I would see air a lot. And there was a handful of episodes I can say that I saw airing all of the time. Red Dress was one, Pool Shark, Catching Cold, Brush with Madness, and this episode. For some reason, these episodes were always on when I wanted to check out the show, just watching it on the network. So I've seen this episode a lot in my lifetime. And I recently just rewatched this for posterity for this review to kind of catch me up to speed of possible things that I missed and forgot about. And I have to say up front, for this being a season 1 episode of the show, I think season 1 had a lot of learning curves for this show. There were some things they were trying out and some ideas that I think some other episodes would do better later on. But I guess we're trying to prove the proof of concept here with the show. And in season 1, they took a lot of stories that were featured in collections from R.L. Stine, known as the Nightmare Hour and the Haunting Hour, but specifically, mostly, if not all of the stories pulled from those 2 books came from the first one, the Nightmare Hour. And the Nightmare Inn episode here is based off of the short story counterpart in the Nightmare Hour. So this is one of those episodes that are based on a story that R.L. Stine actually wrote. And I can tell you from reading the short story casually, I haven't finished the Nightmare Hour book yet, and I'm going to put off doing a short story versus episode for this until I finally sit down and finish Nightmare Hour, which probably will be sooner than later. I'm looking at you, Horrorlander, out there who's been asking me to review that book. So stay tuned. It'll be coming, like I said, very, very soon. But until then, I'm not going to get too much into detail about my thoughts of the short story, but I will say, I think comparing this to the short story, this feels a whole lot more richer, and there's a lot more to it, which often than not was one of this show's greatest strengths when it came to adapting source material, which it didn't do often because The Haunting Hour was mostly a show that provided brand new stories. They just used the Haunting Hour branding associated with R.L. Stine to kind of shoehorn in some of his stories into the show from time to time. But um, when they were there, often than not, the the episodes had more to do, and it was a very rare case when the short stories actually were better. You know what I mean? And I would say, to give you a little taste, I think that the episode offers more than its short story. But is it great things? Is it even good? We'll discuss that later. So, without further ado, let's get into Nightmare Inn's episode and see what it's about. So, the episode revolves around this girl named Jillian, and she looks to be around the age of 13, maybe 14. And she is in a car with her mom headed towards this secluded inn out in the countryside somewhere. And we learned very early in the episode, within like the first few minutes, that Jillian has lost her dad. And her dad perhaps died in a tragic accident along the highway from their house that leads to this inn that connects, I guess, her and her mom to her father. And we learned some bits and pieces with that in the episode, but it's never really expanded on to the greatest extent here. But essentially, Jillian, ever since her dad has died, she's been plagued with these nightmares. And the nightmares seem so real that she has no discernible um, grasp on what's real and what isn't real, essentially. And she's trying to fight sleep in the car ride, and it gets to the point where she thinks she sees something on the road and almost causes her mom to crash the car. So her mom essentially tells her to close her eyes and get some sleep because she needs to get some rest. And, why not go ahead and start sleeping before they get to this inn where they're going to spend the night. And the reason why they're doing so is because the mom has decided that she's going to end up buying the inn, which is kind of fallen into disarray, or I guess mismanagement. They're not getting enough business these days, and it's run by this woman named Priscilla that we meet later on, who kind of admits to them that the business isn't good, right? So the mom's looking into this as a business venture, and Jillian is like, okay, well, this is a bit weird that we're buying this inn that is associated with dad and all of that, but she kind of rolls with it. And we see that they arrive at the inn and meet up with Priscilla, who's holding this lantern in a very ominous way, which should set off your red flag alarms, but we'll get into that shortly. And Priscilla proceeds to take Jillian and her mother to the room that they're going to be staying in, which is room 7B. Now, I don't know of the significance of this room, but perhaps it was the room that her father stayed in when he had a fateful happenstance happen to him in the story. It's very vague on what exactly happens, but it possibly involves a car crash and them heading to this inn and this room. Just roll with it, right? So, anyways, when Jillian decides to enter the room, she thinks that she hears a noise and something grabs her out of the doorway. And before we get to see what happens, it's revealed to all be a dream. And Jillian had fallen asleep in the car, like before, when her mom advised her to do so. So Jillian, we see, is having struggles discerning the real and unreal. And we get caught up to speed the next morning when Jillian's mom is having to go have a meeting, I guess, for business purposes for the inn. So Jillian's going to be left at the inn all day by herself. And when her mom finally leaves to go on this business meeting, she runs into this boy named Caleb. And Caleb seems to be like this emo guy. He's kind of mysterious in that Twilight kind of way, where he's, saying, I don't have much friends. Nobody really pays attention to me. But maybe we can hang out while you're here. And Jillian's like, okay, you're kind of weird, but we can hang out. And Caleb's catching the attention of Priscilla, who is, I guess, the runner of this inn. And Priscilla seems to not like that these two are hanging out. And Caleb is essentially dropping some tea about Priscilla um, to Jillian, like, hey, you need to be wary of this woman. And she's like, all right, whatever. And then when Caleb kind of, you know, moseys off for a little bit, Jillian is cornered by Priscilla and is told by her that Caleb can't be trusted. He has a lot of emotional behavioral issues. He's been institutionalized. He's no good. You need to stay away from him. And then once, Priscilla goes off and does what she needs to do, Caleb comes back in the picture and essentially tells Jillian that no, Priscilla needs to be the person to watch out for. She's a kleptomaniac. She's a pathological liar. You can't believe anything that the woman says. So Jillian is kind of torn and put in between a rock and a hard place on who to trust. But she realizes that there's this necklace that was given to her by her father, made of pure silver, that has been taken, and she can't find it. And she remembers that Priscilla might be a kleptomaniac, and perhaps there was a hint dropped to her by Caleb that she possibly has this said necklace. So Priscilla kind of puts two and two together once Priscilla told Jillian that her mom called her, but when she goes to the phone to call her back, the phone's been disconnected. And she decides to go investigate Priscilla's room and look for this necklace. And when she's doing so, she overhears that Priscilla and Caleb are having this conversation. And when she goes inside of this closet kind of area, she notices that there's some boards in the wall that are very loose and looks like something has torn through it. So she decides to make a break for it because she overhears them kind of talking about messing with Jillian and they might be in on it together. Well, Jillian takes it upon herself just to get herself out of the situation. And we see that Priscilla and Caleb are kind of looking for her. And before we get to realize what's going to happen, of course, nightfall breaks and it's a full moon. And Jillian is in her room and she's interrupted by Caleb during the middle of the night. And Caleb is, given his spiel about, what they can do. And next thing you know, Caleb ends up turning into a werewolf to essentially come after Jillian. And Jillian is like, all right, well, Caleb obviously can't be trusted, so Priscilla's my only other hope. So she tries to go find Priscilla, and Priscilla essentially has her own plot twist where, of course, she might be a werewolf too, and is telling Caleb, I told you, she's mine, stay away. So the two of them, in their, I guess, werewolf forms, are now chasing Jillian out into the nearby outdoor area surrounding the inn, and Jillian finds this place to hide. And when she's hiding, she notices that Priscilla and Caleb have been fighting each other, trying to come after her, but there might be a hero lurking in the shadows. And let's just say Caleb and Jillian might be taken care of. And before we get to see, too much of the violence, I don't think we ever really get to see the violence in that. We get caught up to speed that there might be a third werewolf in the mix. And the third werewolf has taken upon himself, or itself, I should say, to bring Jillian this silver necklace that was given to her by her father. And when Jillian holds the necklace and looks up at the creature, she wakes up from a nightmare again. I can't make this up. She wakes up from another nightmare. So the story is trying to make you question if all of this actually happened or was this just Jillian having a nightmare, right? And her mom reveals that she's been asleep for 14 hours, and Jillian looks over to her side and sees that her silver necklace that her father gave her is next to her bed. And everything seems to be fine and dandy. Although we don't really see Jillian interact with Caleb or Priscilla anymore in the story. We don't really know what happened to them, but if we're going off the events of the climax, they might still be around. We just don't know. And then the ending makes it even more confusing because we get another glimpse of this third werewolf howling at the moon overlooking the inn, I guess being its guardian now, I guess. And before we figure out anything else in the story, it fades to black and the credits roll. So that in a nutshell is what you're going to expect out of this story here, The Nightmare Inn. Now, I didn't really give too much away near the end, but I kind of did at the same time because, as vague as I was being about it, it's all up into interpretation what happens at the end. So I felt like I could be a little more explicit there. But just know, just go watch the episode to see what I was talking about there. Okay. So, yeah, let's go ahead and talk about this episode. Okay. So, after hearing the plot review, I'm going to say this up front. This episode, the way it's structured historically, has never really worked for me. I don't like dream within a dream stories. In Goosebumps, and I feel like early on my channel, I think I got all of the annoying ones knocked out early on. But this episode, it's like a throwback to those to me. And I guess I'll go ahead and start with negatives because I think my negatives are more pronounced than my positives. And I guess I'll get in on positives with this for this review. Um, I do not like the structure of the story. I believe the short story counterpart had like one dream sequence fake out, but this episode I think it had about three or four. And it's not the biggest deal ever if it doesn't each and every time make you question if what just happened actually happened. And I guess given like the first two fake outs were implied to be straight up dreams, that the others should be just implied to be straight up dreams, which makes this entire episode completely pointless. Because if that's the case, nothing actually happened in the story. It was all in the character's mind. However, the dual interpretation to be had, especially given the ending, is that no, wait, this stuff actually did happen, and perhaps she's blocking this out of her psyche because she has extreme grief and she's still mourning over the death of her father, and this is causing this psyche break where she's having these hallucination type dreams that are actually real and she's just thinking that they're dreams. I couldn't tell you, but the episode is a confusing mess and nothing makes sense. But putting that aside, right? That's not the only problem with this episode. The episode is just very dry. It's just cut and paste, as simple as you could possibly get for a kid's horror story. It's literally just about a girl going to an inn, and there's some creatures, I guess, running the inn that want to hurt her. That possibly could have been involved in hurting her father in the past. There's nothing special about this story that you haven't seen in better kids horror stories, or better yet, if you're coming into this episode hearing that it's a werewolf theme episode and you're looking for some good creature effects and makeup, this episode is so darkly lit that you might as well just say that you'd never see any werewolf makeup unless you get to like the end of the climax where the lighting is somewhat decent and you get to see the third werewolf. The makeup effects in this episode are laughably bad. So there's not a lot there to it either. I mean, it's kind of baffling how low budget this episode is, even compared to some season one episodes. And I'm not saying that Haunting Hour is known for it being a big budget show. No, it was still relatively low budget for its time. It definitely had a bigger budget than something, let's say, of the likes of Are You Afraid of the Dark or Goosebumps. But at the same time, they cut corners a lot. And I'm not trying to knock Neil Fernley here, but he does make it look more low budget than it probably needs to look at times. There's like this weird shot where he's using like this face frame of this werewolf like panning out, and he does it like two or three times using the same exact shot. It's so goofy, its execution. It's kind of charming, but I just don't see how that's an actual positive here. I mean, comparing this to most Haunting Hour episodes, I would say that this is relatively one of the more low budget ones, and that's saying a lot, given that there is some prosthetic work here, but there's not a lot to this story. I mean, I guarantee this didn't cost them hardly anything to make. I'm not saying that that is a knock to it, but it just looks cheap, and I just don't like the look of the episode wholesale. Whether we're talking about the color grading, the semi CGI going on, or even the practical effects, none of it is appealing to me. So it's a definite negative there too. And I'm just gonna, nail this one last negative home. The ending and the whole thing involving the dad in the story, which is a positive at the same time, and I'll get into that in the positives. I don't like the ending. I don't like how ambiguous it is. I don't like how it just makes you question everything in the story, whether it happened or not. It's not a way that I would have gone to end the story. And I wish that this story actually had an actual climax because the climax we got was so rushed through. It was kind of embarrassing. Um, I would have completely restructured that for the third werewolf to come into play and have a big actual battle with these other two werewolves to save Jillian. I think that would have been a great spectacle to build to in the story, and that would have definitely livened up this episode and made it more memorable. And that's probably what it deserves to be. But sadly, coupled with the positives I do have with it, because of how rushed it is in the climax, and because of just how whatever it ends up being in the execution, this episode's just straight up forgettable. It's not all that rewatchable, which evidently sucks. But I do have some strong positives with it too. Um, and I'm not trying to undersell this episode whatsoever, but I think Jillian and her emotions with her father are very palpable in the story, and you definitely can tell through the actress's portrayal of this character that she's going through missing her dad and not knowing what happened to him, and that's somehow lingering in the back of her mind. And you can put two and two together that these nightmares that are happening to her are perhaps dealt with trauma and the unknown of not knowing what happened to her dad. So yeah, Jillian is a sympathetic and empathetic character and easy to get behind, which I really like. For Haunting Hour standards, the setting of this story is pretty nice. I like that it's set in this desolate inn. You don't really get much atmosphere out of it because it's mostly just filmed on the grounds of the inn and it never explores anything else outside of it. But for what it was, the inn was kind of creepy. It was darkly lit at times, and I'm not gonna lie, there are some shots in the dream fakeouts that you don't know what's going on, and it does make you kind of go, that was kind of tense. Good job, show. So, yeah, some really good utilizations of the setting here. Really did help the story pop. But I think that the biggest shining light to this story is the underbelly of it, which is what the story is talking about. This is a more thematic story than your average kids horror story out there, and I think that this stands out for that at least. And what it's trying to talk about is that people that you lose in your life, and especially when we're dealing with loved ones, there is this idea that they are still with you. And the story is quite literally a play on that idea that a lost loved one is still watching over you, is still around trying to protect you as a guardian angel almost. And it's touching and endearing for that. This episode, quite honestly, feels like an Are You Afraid of the Dark episode, not a Haunting Hour one. And I don't know if that was done on purpose. I don't know if they were trying to experiment with what they were trying to, mix with tone in the seasons. With the first season here, I couldn't tell you, but this feels like an Are You Afraid of the Dark throwback type of story. And if you're a fan of Are You Afraid of the Dark more than Goosebumps, this might do it for you, despite all the negatives that I've been saying about it. And yeah, I think that the theme here is executed pretty nicely. If we're to imply that this third werewolf perhaps is tied to being a guardian angel or perhaps being Jillian's father, I think that's kind of nice, and I'm glad that it is there to kind of chew on when you catch on to those things in the story. So yeah, the Nightmare Inn. That's basically all I have to say. I have some pretty even positives and negatives with it, but when it comes to me rating this thing, part of me wants to really believe that this is a good episode, but I just don't believe it. For me to give this thing like a 3.5 out of 5 stars, there has to be something here that makes it stand out or make it seem like it's par, right? I just don't feel like this episode knew what it was really trying to do. And because of all the fake outs, and the dream within a dream stuff, and making it all confusing, and the bad effects and the bad CGI, and the whatever plot twist that it decided to roll with, this just felt very mediocre in execution. It's not necessarily something like Locker 13 from the Nightmare Room TV show, or what's another one? Maybe like a few Goosebumps episodes that were evident downgrade, like Vampire Breath's episode. That's a good example. It's not quite to that level, but I can't help but feel like I have to group it in the same camp as Vampire Breath from Goosebumps 90s show, or Locker 13 from the Nightmare Rooms TV show. It's just one of those episodes that are just extremely, extremely, extremely mediocre. So from a 0 to 5 star basis, I'm going to kind of weigh those negatives heavy here. And I might regret this decision. This is definitely an episode I can see myself maybe bumping up in the future. I just have to get caught up to speed with the rest of the show. But as of now, I think I'm going to give this thing about a 3.3 out of 5 stars, which is a D, but it's like a D plus or pushing it. It's an okay episode, okay at best, sadly enough. It's pushing decent, but there just needs to be some more tweaks there to fix these problems. If these problems weren't there, I'd probably give this a solid C tier. But there's just nothing really stand out, like performance wise, to kind of counterbalance the negatives I have here. There's nothing really stand out too much about the setting, other than it's not too typical for Haunting Hour standards, which makes it stand out, I guess. And yeah, there's some solid emotions here, but there's some other episodes, especially in this show later on, that I think tackles similar ideas and just does it better. So yeah, that's where I'm at with this. This is an okay episode, 3.3 out of 5 star, D plus material. Some people might rate it higher than me. Some people might even rate it lower. I can kind of see both ways there, but I'm just speaking my truth, and that's just how I feel about this one. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Nightmare Inn's episode. Let me know down in the comment section if you've seen this episode before. Do you love it? Do you hate it? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.